Hello, comrades. How's everyone feeling tonight? Woo! All right. So my name is Richie Marino. I'm a second-year graduate student at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, pursuing a master's in public administration, and I'm an organizer with Harvard for Bernie. Harvard for Bernie was formed after a group of Harvard students passionate about Bernie's call for a political revolution participated in a program called Students for Bernie Summer School. As soon as we got to campus in September, we immediately began organizing the Harvard community in pursuit of an ambitious, progressive agenda that transforms our economic and political systems so that they work for all of us and not just the 1%. Tonight's event will explore contemporary American leftism through two panels. The first regarding progressive media coverage in the face of a corporate media monopoly, and the second regarding the left's battle for the soul of the Democratic Party. Our vision is to establish a presence for leftist perspectives on Harvard's campus and the Cambridge-Boston community. In addition, we hope to distinguish these perspectives from the moderate liberal ones that are prevalent in the Democratic Party establishment and the majority of mainstream media. Before we begin, I have to read a disclaimer. The views and opinions expressed at tonight's events are those of the speakers only and do not reflect the official policy or position of Harvard University or any of its affiliates. With that being said, welcome to the first annual Leftist Conference at Harvard University. Now we'll welcome Piper Winkler to the stage for opening remarks. Piper is a junior at Harvard College, majoring in comparative literature and also an organizer with Harvard for Bernie.
Hello, everyone. Before I begin, I want to clarify that my words are my own. They do not represent any of the organizations that are co-sponsoring this event. I want to thank you all for being at this conference tonight. The words of Eugene Debs in his Canton, Ohio speech feel appropriate in this moment. How good it is to look into your glowing faces this afternoon. You are all really good looking to me, I assure you. And I'm glad there are so many of you. Many of us have come together tonight, some no doubt interested to see how class warfare suits Harvard University. Since we announced this event, I've heard and seen people remarking with surprise and irony that Harvard should be the site of anything to do with the class war. But I assure you, nothing could be more at home at Harvard than the class war. It has been 384 years in the making. Perhaps you have read an article from one of our panelists, Meagan Day. Defend Your Class, which ran in Jacobin last April. Defend Your Class is named for the slogan that inspired Harvard students to leave the classroom in 1912 and to take up arms with the National Guard to break the Lawrence Bread and Roses strike. What was the threat from which the class of the Harvard elite needed defense? It was a movement of the working class, men, women, and children, of 30 countries of origin, speaking 45 languages, demanding freedom from the daily threats to their lives posed by underpaid and dangerous jobs, and even more radically, the freedom to exist beyond the value assigned to their labor by the capitalist bosses. What was the value of those three words? Defend your class, to the Harvard undergraduate militiamen. Perhaps you know that hundreds of strikers were beaten and thrown in jail by the strikebreakers, and that 2 were murdered. For demonstrating their allegiance to their class, the Harvard students received course credit. You hear it said often now, and it has always been true. This is part of the legacy of a Harvard degree, of a Harvard education. Progress at Harvard, you may say, has surely taken place in the last 100 years, and I would say you are right. The Harvard brand has expanded fabulously in its prestige and in its power, and above all, it has progressed in its capacity to defend its class. About a mile from where we are gathered here, there's a new engineering school going up in Lower Alston, described by our president Bacow as a jewel of a building, $1 billion in its making. This complex has been described as the first inkling of Harvard's vision for a new Lower Alston, a new vision for one of the last affordable neighborhoods in Boston, while hundreds of our neighbors sleep on the streets every night. Now that is all just pretty talk for a class war. Progress indeed. Harvard's progress is not our progress. Has anyone watching our teaching fellows and course assistants strike in the yard for fair pay and decent health care? Has anyone watching this go on taken comfort in the fact that 62 of the world's current billionaires are Harvard affiliates, Harvard graduates? Who among us reads that the Harvard endowment has reached $40 billion in the fiscal year 2019 and celebrates, knowing that these dollars rebound from investments in the modern slavery of private prisons and the global destruction of fossil fuels? We do not, because Harvard's progress is not our progress. This institution stands rank and file with the National Guard of 1912, with the Henry Kissingers of 1969, and the war profiteering presidents of the 2000s, Republican and Democrat. And in these 384 years, it has not missed a single step. My task is not to build up a pile of evidence against Harvard out of hatred or spite. My point is far more important. What I want to illustrate for you is that the war-making, strike-breaking impulses of this institution are not random, they are not unrelated. In fact, they could not be more coordinated. What they show us is that Harvard is a case study in unity, and that unity is in the name of the almighty profit motive, the power of the next dollar and the dollar after that. That is what we all are worth to it. But every single one of you is worth the world to me. I hope that you feel that way about one another because our shared future depends upon it. We can comfort, rally, mourn, and transform the face of the earth with this knowledge. Unity is not a substitute for solidarity. Unity is not a substitute for solidarity. In the words of St. Augustine, charity is not a substitute for justice. When our brothers and sisters in the homeless community walk into an apartment and call it home, we will say, this is justice and not charity. When working class children enroll in free college instead of in the army in order to build a better life, we will say, this is justice and not charity. When we realize and honor Fred Hampton's vision for a rainbow coalition against a racist police and incarceration system, against the starvation of children and against the commodification of healthcare, we will say, this is not charity, this is not generosity, this is not a concession, this is justice. Charity lets us know that we do not deserve so much as our own survival. In our time, the great crescendo of class warfare, something tells me that the powerful institutions of this world will continue to become ever less charitable. Let us take this thing out of their hands and into our own. Let us have justice, a justice made possible by solidarity. There is no substitute on earth for that. I am a literature student, and so, of course, I am thinking of a verse written by the revolutionary poet W.B. Yeats. A verse that Yeats wrote in praise of a friend bred to a harder thing than triumph. As a volunteer for the Bernie Sanders campaign, I have knocked hundreds of doors in Iowa and in New Hampshire. I will not forget the Iowans that I met shortly before the new year. I spoke to a woman who shared that she was on leave from her low-wage job because a physical disability made the work too painful. But what decided her vote was the idea of a world in which she could afford mental health care. She told me about the struggles she faces every day to get out of bed, and then told me that on February 3rd, she would get out of bed, and then she would get into her car and drive to a caucus site where she will caucus for Bernie Sanders. She would do all of these things in the name of a harder thing than triumph. Let us remember, with fierce love and tenderness, the great anti-war activist Al Johnson, who canvassed among us in Nashua every weekend. Brother Johnson passed away on the first day of the new year. From his deathbed on December 31st, 2019, Brother Johnson made 200 phone calls for the presidential campaign of Bernie Sanders. Born to a Kentucky coal miner growing up in the public housing of Massachusetts, he was imprisoned as a conscientious objector of the Vietnam War. He spent a year in that military prison for loving peace. Al Johnson was bred to a harder thing than triumph. Al Johnson was bred to solidarity his entire life. Let us be bred to a harder thing than triumph, the thing that makes triumph possible. Let it be solidarity. For then our work can never come to nothing. In the last day of his life, Al Johnson placed 200 calls in the name of a world that he would not live to see. What great certainty he had in those final hours. Not a certainty in victory, but a certainty in the value of your life and my life, in the right to live in peace. That is an endless victory that will outlast every brick and ivy leaf of this institution. Let us be so certain in our shared purpose and certain in our way forward. With every worker with temporary protected status, with every student with DACA status, with every climate refugee, with every community affected by the so-called war on drugs, with every union man and woman, we are certain that the world must change because we belong in it. The day will come when the working class lives in the housing it has built and benefits from the labor it has provided. We must work for that day together in solidarity, and we must accept no substitute. We must cast our votes for solidarity. We must cast our votes for solidarity in 2020, but this is only the beginning. Thank you.
That's Piper Winkler, everybody. Alrighty now, so we're going to move on to our first panel. The first panel is titled, "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised," and it will be moderated by Sam Sadeh and Smit Chitra. Sam is a second-year graduate student at the Harvard Graduate School of Education in the Technology, Innovation, and Education program and an organizer with Harvard for Bernie. Smit is a junior at Harvard College majoring in social anthropology and also an organizer with Harvard for Bernie. All right, and now to introduce our panelists. Woo! Krystal Ball is a progressive journalist who co-hosts The Hills Rising with over 230 subscribers.
It's more than 230. It is more than 230.
Okay, this needs some updating. She founded the People's House Project in 2017. Her newest book, The Populist Guide to 2020, co-authored by Sagar and Jetty, will be released in early February. Meagan Day is a staff writer at Jacobin and a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. She is a co-author with Micah Utricht of the forthcoming book, Bigger Than Bernie, How We Go From the Sanders Campaign to Democratic Socialism, coming out this year on Verso. Nomiki is an activist, investigative reporter, and host of the recently launched The Nomiki Show. Konst is also a board director of Matriarch, and in 2019, Konst ran a spirited grassroots campaign for NYC Public Advocate, hoping to refocus the office on its essential watchdog duties. And last, but certainly not least, Katie Halper is a writer, political commentator, and podcast host, currently co-hosting Useful Idiots, and her own show, The Katie Halper Show. Her writing has appeared in New York Magazine, The Nation, and more. She has co-produced and served as an outreach director for a number of award-winning films and documentaries. Please welcome our panelists.
Wow, it is a tremendous honor to be up here moderating. We're your humble moderators with these four incredible people. So we're going to get right to the point. We want to ask each of you, what is your experience in alternative media, and what factors led you to where you are today?
All right, so I'll start. First of all, thank you, Harvard for Bernie, for putting this together. It's an incredible event, and I have to say, Piper, wow.
Yeah.
You know, there have been a number of things giving me a lot of hope recently, and I suspect that you all feel the same, but it is hard to imagine anything giving me more optimism and hope for the future of solidarity and the ability to forge a new type of consensus in America than seeing this room come together at this institution with two overflow rooms of capacity, the energy to come together in solidarity and do something new. It takes courage, and to see you all here, it's just inspiring and incredible. So thank you all so much for coming out tonight. So I'm in a little bit of an unusual space because I'm in alternative corporate media. As many of you know, I host a show called Rising at The Hill. That's what's on my radar, as I might say. And so what's interesting is, The Hill's a very traditional DC establishment media type place, right? I mean, it started as a literal newspaper on Capitol Hill. They like to have a down the center kind of a voice. And so when they approached me about doing a morning show, I was excited about the idea because I thought there was a need for a different type of programming, a different type of morning show, but it was very important to me from the start that I have a creative control over the process. Now, it was important to them that we have a left voice and a right voice. So I said, fine, no problem, but let me have some input into who the right voice is. So as you all know, my co-host is Sagar Enjeti, who is fantastic. We disagree on many things, but we fundamentally agree on this idea of forging a new working class centric politics. And so that's why if you watch the show, you actually see a lot of consensus around diagnosing the core rot in America that would lead to the dynamic where you have GDP rising and life expectancy falling, where you would have the worst addiction crisis in our nation's history at the same time that unemployment is supposedly so low. So we have a similar analysis of that sort of core structural rot in the country that enables us to have a shared perspective in a lot of areas. So that's the show that we do. It's kind of funny because it's different, I think it's fair to say, than what the people at The Hill who put us together and put us on air originally envisioned, just being candid. But the response to it has been so overwhelming that they can't deny the energy around this type of politics. Because what do you see on cable news, right? You see some channels who are just cheering for Team D all the time. It's a sort of like sports that your co-host Matt Taibbi talks about this. It's almost like sports fans cheering for Team D. You've got other places that are like sports fans cheering for Team R. No one is questioning power. Right? No one is questioning their own side. No one is questioning the people who actually have the levers and hold control in DC and across the country. So we took a bet on, I think there's an appetite for this, and boy, has the response been incredible. So that's another thing that has given me great energy. But that's a long way of saying that's what I'm doing in alternative media, sort of. And I think what's alternative about the type of media that we're doing is just this very different voice and way of approaching day-to-day politics that there's been a need for and a hunger for in the nation.
So I'm Meagan Day, and I'm a writer for Jacobin magazine, which is a socialist magazine, and I myself was not
a self-identified socialist until I encountered the presidential campaign of Bernie Sanders in 2016. It's not that I didn't think that socialists were right. I actually did. I was a somewhat regular reader of Jacobin magazine, and I frequently had the thought, these socialists, other people of course, they seem like they're correct about stuff a lot of the time. And then I would sort of go about what I was doing, right? But when Bernie Sanders ran for president last time, what happened was an intensification of the class struggle. And when there is an intensification of class struggle, the question is put to millions of people, which side are you on? And then you have to answer that question for yourself. I actually have an anecdote to this effect. There's another side of the story that was just told about Harvard in 1912. So while the university was encouraging Harvard students to become violent strikebreakers, there were other students on Harvard who were members of the Intercollegiate Socialist Society. And in 1912, they endorsed Eugene Debs for president. So this was a moment of heightened class struggle, 1912, very much so. And even people in the hallowed halls of Harvard were asking themselves, which side are you on? And answering that for themselves. That moment came for me when Bernie Sanders ran for president for the first time. And it led me to meetings of the Democratic Socialists of America, and eventually it led me to become a writer for Jacobin magazine. As for what I'm doing, we don't break news. We are not reporters. Sometimes people get angry at me because other people describe me as a journalist, and yet I don't behave like a journalist, so there must be something wrong with what I'm doing. What I think of myself as doing is, ideally, and I don't say this to flatter myself, but it's something that that I aspire to, is following in the tradition of socialist political writing that goes all the way back to when Karl Marx was a quote-unquote journalist for the New York Daily Tribune, looking at what was happening around the world and trying to digest the information and impart lessons based on his understanding that society was shaped by constant, perpetual, churning class struggle. Whether or not there was a working class fight back, there was class struggle happening. There was a class war being waged. And so he would write these articles about the current events that were happening and try to, reflect them through that prism. And I think that's a noble tradition, and that's something that I try to do at Jacobin magazine, not just me, but everybody at Jacobin. And I couldn't be happier. I had a career in media, sort of, before this. And this is not a career in media. This is a life of socialist struggle. And it's nourishing, and it's very difficult, but I wouldn't have it any other way.
I think, so the question was about how I entered this space of alternative left media, I guess is how you would put it. Like Krystal, I think we have similar experiences, yours much more so, working in the confines of corporate media, cable news, operating on their system of rules and the stories that they want to present. What I learned in 2016, very much like you, it shifted my perspective, not just on class issues, but on institutions. I'm 36 years old as of yesterday, and I'm a millennial. Wasn't asking. But I'm a millennial. I came of age during the economic crisis as the internet was becoming a tool, a voice for so many people who didn't have a voice in the media. It's as donations suddenly could come from small dollar donors as opposed to large donors. And of course, the fall of media. You had the media crisis that really emerged after the financial crisis, and the first thing that was cut in newsrooms were journalists, were investigative reporters and State House reporters. Of course, most corruption begins locally and rises up, and the first to be cut were State House reporters. Investigative reporters, my mentor was a man named Wayne Barrett. He was a notable reporter from New York. He was the first reporter to ever investigate Trump, wrote a book on Trump and 2 on Rudy Giuliani. I wish he were alive today. He passed away the day before the inauguration of a long-time illness. But those types of reporters don't really exist anymore. And And that's why what you're doing is so powerful, because you're bringing back something that is so well needed at this moment. And what I learned from Wayne was how to examine institutions. And I will never be what Wayne Barrett is. But coming up in an age when institutions failed at every level, I will pretty much say that. It's interesting to shift from cable news and corporate media. I worked at SiriusXM. I had a show there 5 days a week, 3 hours a day. And I, of course, was doing the cable news circuit, CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News. And the stories, of course, that are covered there are reflective of what the institutions want to discuss, who they want on the panels, what kinds, they started cutting reporters and putting on all these panelists like it was a sports game. And so CNN suddenly thought, oh, ratings from getting people to shout at each other over things that really aren't affecting most people's lives. Mm-hmm. We're not having real conversations about the military-industrial complex and, Iran, real conversations. We're having conversations over hand gestures and backroom conversations, rumors,
I just did the Pelosi.
I was talking about Bernie's, gesture.
Violent anger.
Violent gestures, yeah. So while they're really failing at their job, and they should have learned their lessons from 2016, they would have a few leftists on cable. Now they don't have any on. And so it's dangerous for them, but it also has created an opportunity for so many of us, because even though monopolies exist and YouTube is playing with the algorithms and it's harder for us to get our word out, it is still a space where we have the freedom to create our own content, to editorial power, and to seek out the guests that we want to seek out that will never be on corporate media. Just as a brief overview, right now on corporate media, and I'll say this over and over, the people who are on cable news shows are in bed, if not part of the economic oppression in this country. You have consultants who are representing weapons manufacturers who appear on CNN on a nightly basis and do not disclose that. You have people on those panels who have made billions of dollars off of losing an election to Donald Trump.
Right.
That is what exists, and it's just so powerful that we are here on this panel able...
You mean the people who are so certain this time
Yes,
that Bernie
so
can't win? Like, wait a second. Tell me about your track record again.
Yeah, exactly. But there's a lot of money in that. So I now have a show. It's not even a week old, but there's a lot of freedom in having your own show, so I can't speak too much to it, but it's a nice space to be in, and I'm learning from my friends here and, of course, out here.
I'll be quick so I want to hear more from you guys, less from myself. So I have a show I have one very alternative show, which is the Katie Halper show, which is started on WBAI, the radio station, which is Pacifica's New York affiliate. And all of these wonderful people have been on the show, by the way. And that's another thing that we should talk about at some point, which is kind of the Piper was saying, the solidarity and the
They've all been
kind
on
of
my show too.
What did you say?
Nomi was literally on my show today.
Oh, there you go. And then I'm on this other show called Useful Idiots with Matt Taibbi, which is unbelievably enough a Rolling Stone show, which is not alternative media. But it is, but it's not independent media. It's not technically alternative. So there's commercial and then there's non-commercial. And obviously WBI is not commercial. But for me, I think that I always had leftist politics and I was raised, I'm like, if anyone saw Annie Hall, where he's like, so let me guess you come from like a very strike-oriented family and from Central Park West and socialist summer camp. So that's me. But I'm from Riverside Drive, if that means anything to you guys. It's another avenue on the Upper West Side. But what for me was amazing in 2016 was watching the people who I always thought were kind of active in the liberal, not leftist space, not act as leftists once Bernie came around. Because when Sanders came out as a viable candidate, It was like, okay, now all these people who claimed to be more centrist or more liberal or working with Obama or really excited about Obama for pragmatic reasons, now we're all going to be with Sanders, now that we've seen this person who actually is a real radical progressive. And when they didn't come around, I was like, wait, so you actually are ideologically liberal. You're not pragmatically liberal. And that was like a line in the sand. And then I always knew that the Dems were corrupt, and I always knew that the Democratic media machine was corrupt, but it was kind of like, well, between the Dems and Republicans, between Fox and MSNBC, I kind of prefer the Dems, and I kind of prefer MSNBC. But I didn't get it on the visceral level that I did in 2016. The hatred of Sanders, the open hatred of Sanders, the total erasure and hypocrisy committed by people claiming to be champions of marginalized people, to want to make a diverse political system which represented the underdogs and was not a homogenous straight white male monolith. Watching those people actually invisibilize and erase and marginalize anyone who wasn't a straight white man, who was a leftist, who was a Sanders supporter, watching them pretend that leftist politics were this exclusive domain of straight white men was such a perversion of reality and such a disgusting weaponization of something really important, identity politics. And also the reason I think that people were excited about my show was just because I happened to be, well, I'd like to think I have a good show, but I was one of the only feminists who was outspoken as a Sanders supporter. And that's not because feminists aren't Sanders supporters, and a lot of feminists would argue he is the most feminist candidate out there, running for president, right? It's just that none of them were given a voice. And so this monolithic voice of corporate lean-in, pantsuit, jumpsuit, whatever. Pantsuit Nation feminism, that was like supposed to be all of feminism, and that was really terrible. So the cool thing though, like just coming back to what I said at the beginning, there is a cool solidarity because I feel closer than ever now with people who we are like on the same team, and we have a shared contempt, I think, of people who we used to be like going to parties with, which is kind of weird.
Oh my God.
But I also want to say that something related to that is that I now also feel like people I used to dismiss or like turn my back on because they're people I used to dismiss as problematic, who I now think we are fighting for. And so it's kind of a realignment of enemies and allies.
What do you mean by that?
What do I mean by that? I mean, when I was at when I was a Wesleyan student, if people didn't have certain positions already, I was like, you're problematic, boo. And I would, but like, I don't know what I thought would happen. Like a bunch of Wesleyan people would rule the world and vote on things by consensus. Like, I don't know what I thought would happen. But now I'm like, no, the irredeemables are the liberals and neoliberals who write for The Atlantic or like the New York Times or the Washington Post or whatever, those are the people who are the basket of deplorables. They are, because they're not changing because they have vested interest in this and whatever. Anyway, those are the people we turn our backs on, and not the people who we can win over, or who stay at home. Those are the two groups we should focus on. Yeah.
All right, thank you all so much for the context on your lives and what brought you here. Katie, you brought up something that I want to dig more into, and it's like the why. Why have attacks against progressives turned into this weaponized identity politics, anti-Semitism, sexism, and then how can we fight against that?
Right. Okay, great question. Also, I forgot to say, at the beginning you said that none of what we say represents Harvard, but I did clear it with Alan Dershowitz. And everything I say, I'm speaking for the dirt. Well, that's a really good question because, and one of my big focuses has been the Bernie bro narrative, which is a totally disingenuous, yes, it's a smear, it's a racist smear, it's a sexist smear, it's a homophobic smear that invisibilizes all the people, the diverse coalition, multiracial coalition that supports Sanders and leftist politics. But I think that what happens is there are people who want a They don't want a 99% and top 1%. They want a diverse top 10%.
Right.
And
Oh, wow.
which is better, I guess. Yeah. I mean, but that shouldn't be the final point, right? And they want, they can't say, for instance, I don't care about people dying because they don't have health care. They can't say, why don't we just privatize Social Security because it sounds like a good idea. They can't say who cares about having a living wage. So what they have to say is that, oh, these things are luxuries or privileges, or because what they used to be able to say is that that these weren't popular, and they can't say that anymore because I mean, and I'm obviously very Sandersian, but like I'm kind of using him as a shorthand. I think he is both a transformational, revolutionary figure, and also the product of a larger movement, but. People can no longer pretend that these things are pie in the sky. They try to, but so how do they delegitimize these policies or the people who are promoting them? So first they have to pretend some of them don't exist, and then they have to vilify the ones they do acknowledge. Again, they can't vilify Sanders for wanting to literally save people's lives or wanting people to be able to afford things. So they have to talk about his wagging finger, the way he, I don't know, like what someone uses too many exclamation points on Twitter. And there are all these articles right now about the Bernie bro, which it's really interesting. There are people who are toxic online. Every single candidate has toxic supporters. And if you understand misogyny and racism, which these people claim to care about and understand, you get that these things are systemic and not the exclusive domain of one candidate's supporters. But what's amazing is you have people like Sanders condemns this, and he's never participated in anything like this, and none of his surrogates have either, and no high-profile people have. On the other side, though, I wish this weren't true, but it's not the same. So you have Hillary Clinton sending personal letters and getting her photo taken with the people on Twitter who call Sanders a fake fucking Jew. Neera Tanden gets her photo taken with someone who actually called on his followers to flood your mentions. A guy who said of Linda Sarsour, when Linda Sarsour who condemned the shooting in Pittsburgh of the synagogue, this guy Jeremy Constantinople said, like, look at Linda pretending that she wouldn't have planned this herself. Neera Tanden hangs out with this guy. Okay? Neera Tanden calls the other guy who called Bernie Sanders a fake fucking Jew, who says terrible things about, what people should do to his anatomy, calls him a friend. It's a totally, I'm not saying that there aren't people who are gross online, but there is a high-ranking support of these toxic abusers who are Clintonite and anti-Sanders, and no one talks about it. If anyone cared about this stuff, they would call on people to stop harassing Nina Turner, who they call like a slave. It's not, And you have this article this week, and great, and I'm sorry, and Bakari Sellers talks about how he deals with stuff, and he does, I'm sure. And again, it would be nice if they also said, and Nina Turner does, or Brianna Joy Gray. But, okay, and I won't harp on this too much, it's not symmetrical because you have the media and people like Hillary Clinton and Neera Tanden elevating the voices of these abusers. That doesn't exist on Sanders' side. In fact, you have Brian Williams, who, bless his heart, he's the dumbest person on MSNBC. I mean, I almost find him endearing. He's just so, it's cute when he puts on his glasses. You have him literally reading tweets by a guy who called Bernie's press secretary, who's an African-American woman, he called her white adjacent bro fodder. And Brian Williams thinks it's an appropriate thing to read this guy's tweets on his show. I also hate his voice. So, yes. Anyway, I don't know if I answered the question, but it's basically to be able, because they can't critique leftist politics on its substance.
Right.
They have to do it through these just like weaponized attacks. Yeah.
Well, and there's also such a selective application of the venerating of identity, right? So, they're not going to celebrate Tulsi Gabbard's diversity because she doesn't have the right politics, right? Because that type of, shallow, just surface level identity politics is really just weaponized to maintain the status quo, right? So you can have. So you can have the appearance of change because now maybe you have a gay man as president, Mayor Pete, but you got the same old policies. It's not real change, is it? Sorry, I had to. My candidate. It's not a real change. So, I mean, that's what this is. That's where the hypocrisy becomes so obvious. It's like, oh, so if you were really excited about women of color in this primary, get on board the Tulsi train, guys. Come on. But we all know that that is never going to happen. Or even, you know, maybe at this time of rising anti-Semitism, maybe, just maybe, you might find it exciting that we could have a first Jewish president, right?
Michael Bloomberg.
Son of immigrants, right? Ancestor of Holocaust survivors. Doesn't that matter to you? But no, because it's all selective. And you know what? Being ideological, I don't have a problem with that. I vote on ideology, that's fine, but don't dress it up, right? Don't pretend that it's something else. You support these candidates because they fit your status quo, class interest, neoliberal ideology. That's why. Don't pretend to make it progressive with this like sort of sheen of change when really the underlying policies just result in the same working class getting screwed policies that we've had for decades.
I also want to emphasize something that you just said, Krystal, which is that this is about maintaining the neoliberal status quo, and beyond that, the broader capitalist status quo. And there are examples throughout history where we can see that dividing people up on the basis of race or gender or sexuality is a very potent way to keep people from uniting, to take what belongs to all of them. And, you know, one example that from history that might be useful to think about is that in New Orleans, before the Civil War, actually, there were white dock workers, many of them German immigrants, Irish immigrants, who actually wanted the abolition of slavery because for personal reasons they felt that having people who were not paid anything at all working in their midst was driving their wages down. And then when slavery was abolished, black workers, newly freed slaves came to New Orleans to work on the docks, and this posed another problem for their material self-interest because these workers were coming with nothing, which means that they were still undercutting their wages. So they went very quickly from being abolitionists to racists. They began to say things like send them to Africa, you know. And this created a scenario in which for decades black and white workers in New Orleans actually had separate unions, and they were competing economically against each other until every time each group would strike, the bosses would simply bring in the other group to be scabs or strike breakers, until eventually the white unions looked around and they realized that if they wanted a strike that wasn't going to get broken, they were going to have to ally with the black unions. And so they formed something called the Triple Alliance, which was 2 white unions and a black union. And they had a general strike in New Orleans in the late 19th century, and it worked. And from there on, they actually instituted a rule where black and white, the unions did, where they wanted black and white workers to work together on the docks so that they would be able to develop solidarity with each other, because they realized that for pure materially interested reasons, solidarity was the only thing that was going to get the goods. Of course, workers sometimes know this. The working class sometimes realizes this. But the capitalist class always knows this. They always know that they have to keep people divided. Otherwise, their worst nightmares are going to come true.
That's right.
And so you do see, it's hard to know exactly how coordinated it is, but you just see that, you know, when the capitalist class and the people who are representatives of the capitalist class become afraid, they reach for the closest tool in their toolkit, which is, don't be mad at me, be mad at one of these other people. Be mad at this person on the basis of their skin color, be mad at this person on the basis of their gender. And it's developed some more complexity as we have grown more progressive over time, which is a very good thing, right? Whereas before it was very simple. It was saying to the white workers, blame the black workers, just be racist against these black workers. It has developed more complexity. It has matured to the point where not only does the capitalist class do that, but it also weaponizes people's very well-founded sense of anti-racism and feminism, and it uses that to say you should be mad at these workers because in fact they are the ones who are upholding the racist status quo, and they are the ones who are upholding the patriarchal status quo. But at the end, what's happening always is that we're not building solidarity across lines of difference in order to build a mass movement that can take what belongs to all working people. right?
So Meagan, can I ask Meagan a question? Understanding this history and where we are right now, where it seems like it's coming from every single direction, whether it's a troll on the internet organized on Reddit or a cable news host or a former presidential candidate, there are triggers. And there are moments Bernie himself has to respond based on to not let the story drag out or because it seems like the right thing to do. And then there are moments where he has to distance himself, and the movement responds. So how do you maneuver this incredibly complicated landscape, given that what you mentioned?
I mean, what Bernie Sanders is doing is proactively identifying demands that are going to appeal to people across lines of difference because they affect people across lines of difference. So, for example, Medicare for All being his flagship demand, that's something that, everybody has a body and everybody needs care. And so he's creating the conditions for people to find their own solidarity. And then, of course, he himself talks about solidarity increasingly. I also want to point out that there are official Bernie Sanders campaign signs that are emblazoned with the words "Solidarity Forever," which is an old labor movement anthem that has kept people going through times of incredible hardship and struggle, and it should make us all feel extremely heartened that a front runner for president is pumping out the words "Solidarity Forever." So yeah, I think he has very... As for responses, you have to figure out what to do on the fly, right? Yeah. You can make it worse. You can make it worse by responding. Sometimes you have to respond because it's snowballing out of control and you can't let people walk all over you and your movement, your very diverse, multiracial, working class movement. But there are other times where the best thing to do, I think, and consistently, what is necessary is to promote a message of solidarity and to use the major sort of social democratic demands to actually create the conditions for it to flourish. And then, of course, you also have wonderful Bernie Sanders surrogates like Philip Agnew over here who knows how to deliver, right? Who knows how to deliver a message of solidarity in a way that's actually very powerful. And if all of you have not seen the recent video of Phil leading a group of people in an exercise in order to demonstrate what solidarity feels like with someone who is more privileged than you or someone who is less privileged than you, I think you should go seek it out. But yes, but putting forward a positive political vision is the only thing that's going to help you weather those attacks at the end of the day.
Yeah. And universality, which is something that you talk a lot about.
Yes.
The universality of the programs, because then you can't have this dynamic of, this is just for those people, right? And those people are always, a disenfranchised or vulnerable group, and that's what we've seen weaponized throughout our history.
Which goes back to the charity versus justice idea, right? Because, you have real working class protectors, warriors like Mayor Pete and Amy Stapler throwing Klobuchar, who pretend that you can't have universal programs because it's not fair to ask working people to pay for like Barron Trump to go to community college.
Right.
And of course, these people are like Mayor Pete. He went to Harvard and he went to Oxford. He's a Rhodes Scholar, and that, of course, means he's a sociopath. Sorry, Harvard. But that's a bad combination. I'm sure there's some exceptions, not all double grads. But these people understand that, like, when you make these things means tested, that they are stigmatized and that they're seen as, again, as charity, not as justice. And then there's a reason there is a term, people talk about the welfare queens, not about Social Security queens, because they know how valuable it is to have programs that they can stigmatize. So yeah, that's another thing. Yeah.
And just to go to that point, because I think what has been effective in 2020 that may not have been, and it's something that they really are scrambling to address, is, I think Mayor Pete, if you look back 6-7 months ago on the cover of Time magazine as being the first gay couple, I don't think he, as a millennial, could ever anticipate how the movement has addressed him and really gone through his record and torn it apart and questioned him. And now, even questioned yesterday on cable news, he was struggling with articulating his positions as somebody who has been nurtured probably from a young age to enter public service. So they're having difficulty dealing with the records, frankly, whether it's Kamala Harris or even, Cory Booker didn't know what lane he was in because he knew he wanted a future in politics, but had a pretty difficult record to address and shifted to the left on many issues as he should have, but needed his donors. So there's a shift happening, and I think it all leads to, hopefully, the end of institutionalized politics that's led by, capitalist theories. So.
I wish this could go on forever because this has been so insightful, but unfortunately we're short on time, so I'm going to try to bundle together a couple questions that we have. First of all, thank you for your insight regarding the diagnoses regarding this problem of weaponized identity politics. We'd like to know a little bit more about what you envision the solutions as being, given that identity politics in this weaponized form are part of a broader trend of deliberate misinformation, coordinated attacks, and systematic exclusion when it comes to the news coverage of anti-establishment candidates by the mainstream media. So how do we challenge the institutional elitism of mainstream media, given that so many people view MSM as beacons of truth? And that too, how do we go about challenging mainstream media while distinguishing ourselves from the Trumpian attacks on the media, considering the moderate liberal tendency to equate the left with the right when it comes to populism?
Right.
And my last question, sorry, so there's a lot to digest. Obviously, progressive media has to play a role. So what do you envision as the future of progressive and anti-establishment media in the United States? We could start with any of you, yeah.
I mean, this is kind of a, maybe not, well, I'll just say it. There's a real attempt to brand certain views and people as extremist or toxic or canceled,
Yes.
and on very frequently about foreign policy and international issues. And you see this with Tulsi Gabbard, for instance. And there are things that I don't like about almost every candidate, but the vilification of Gabbard is, again, as you point out, Krystal, which is interesting because she's a woman of color, and people who claim to, care about these issues have no problem trashing her. But the vilification of her, there's a real neo-McCarthyism and guilt by association and smears that have lives of their own. And I want to just say that even my fellow progressives, from anywhere between progressive and leftist, we need to be better about not being bullied, because there's a tendency to cut off associations with people because this journalist said this journalist interviewed this person, this journalist went to this country and did this. And it's really bad, and it hurts all of us.
That's right.
Yeah.
But we really need to be and I used to be I'm not going to have this person on my show because it's going to be a headache. I don't want to get called XYZ. But enough, honestly, because I have so many people. Whenever I do have someone on my show who's considered that persona non grata, people will say to me, "Look, I'm glad you had them on, and thank you for fighting. I'm too afraid to go after them." But if all of us just said that, these things wouldn't be fringe. They wouldn't be able to marginalize these people, these issues. So we all have to kind of grow a backbone and, not cave in to these neo-McCarthyite attacks.
I kind of want to challenge the premise of the question a little bit. I think the hollowness of those institutions and their failures is already manifest. I mean, if the Iraq War wasn't enough, the financial crisis and the fact that none of the experts saw it coming, right? I mean, all of these failures, and then, the way that, what Donald Trump did vis-a-vis Russia was not acceptable, not okay, the way the campaign opened themselves up for that help. But we were all led to believe night after night we were going to get the P tape. I mean, this was way further. I think the conspiracy theorizing that just gripped every single cable news network and every mainstream institution has just exposed the hollowness and the transparency of their agenda. And it really resonated what Meagan said earlier about how she's sort of dismissed sometimes because she's upfront about the lens that she views and the ideology that she views her politics. And obviously I get the same thing, but gosh, I would prefer that to someone who pretends to be like, oh, I'm just calling balls and strikes here. But when Bernie Sanders accurately cited academic research, actually he gets 3 Pinocchios for that. I mean, you know, the ideology has become so obvious. You can see it. Look, in our politics, who did the New York Times endorse? Amy Klobuchar and Elizabeth Warren. How has it helped them in the polls? Not very much. So I don't think that this, I think the problem is more what comes next, right? There is already only a thin slice of America that even cares what the mainstream media is saying, is even fixate on it, trusts them at all. It's only a thin slice that's left, and it's the slice, it's the audience they're catering to, right? This is a capitalist business. Their audience, their consumer that they want are basically mostly affluent white liberals. That's their audience. That's who the advertisers want. That's who all the coverage is for. And so if you're outside of that audience, you already see the hollowness and the ideology of what they're doing. I think the more challenging question is what comes next. In some ways, the media, by coming up with a variety of excuses for Hillary Clinton's loss, some of them grounded in certain pieces of fact, but they've avoided having to do any real diagnosis of their own failings, and this goes for the Democratic establishment as well. They would rather talk about Russia, they'd rather talk about Comey, they'd rather talk about sexism, all real things, but also great ways to avoid having to talk about the absolute failings of neoliberalism over 30 years, right? So in some ways, I think either the mainstream has to sort of hit rock bottom and actually do some sort of soul searching, which I am not very optimistic is going to happen. I mean, we see them all out with their bad takes again, saying, you know, so certain after they certainly predicted that Trump was going to lose, and before that certainly predicted Barack Obama couldn't get elected, and all those things. They're back out with their bad takes, having done zero self-reflection. So I think it is going to be the alternative that becomes the mainstream. I mean, we talk about it on Rising all the time. You look at the numbers, 70% of America has a boiling anger at the political establishment, right? We are not the minority. We are the majority. The overwhelming majority says we're done with these people. 40% of Americans say when they think about our political institutions, they want to just burn them all down, okay? That's where we are. So the alternative, the so-called alternative, is actually the mainstream view. So to me, that is the future, is these voices becoming larger and more influential. And you see it happening before our very eyes. And those legacy voices being marginalized and increasingly seen for the, you know, the ideologues who have been wrong about everything consistently for what they are.
So Krystal, you know, as this is happening, I just started the show. It's 4 days old. But one of the ideas of the show is now that we are going into 2020, how can we understand what we're getting into? 2016, the Democratic Party played a lot of tricks. Brother Cornel West was on the platform committee. He saw it up front, inside-outside strategy. They played a lot of tricks on us. And we were learning as we go, for the most part. And now we're a little bit wiser. But just, you know, a couple of days ago, the chair of the Democratic Party released a list of folks that are going to be sitting on a set of committees at the convention. Exactly. Deciding how the rules are going to be interpreted or possibly rewritten from the floor of the convention based on whatever we go into. So is it going to be, are we going to have 3, 4 candidates? Are the candidates going to be trading delegates? So the question was, how do we, you know, challenge that and hold them to the fire, right? Like, a lot of these people are on cable news when you look at that list. There is a clear relationship between the two. And I think one of the powerful things that came out of 2016 was that people who were just fed up and frustrated started to research these folks and call them out. And they'd call them out while they were on cable news. They'd engage with them on Twitter. You know, folks with 5 million followers would be responding to folks with 20 followers. They're sensitive.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just as a simple tool, and I'm going to be talking a lot about this on the show, what we can learn from history, what we can learn from their mistakes, what are their strategies and what's in their toolkit, but what is in our toolkit. And I think that is an extremely powerful tool, is holding them accountable. These are not, for the most part, public figures. They are people who make money off of the grift of the cable news industry and the Democratic Party. And as a result, we got Trump, and they know that, and that's why they use those excuses. The first excuse I heard on election night from a Hillary surrogate on air was it was millennials' fault. Turns out that's not what the data said. It was all the millennials' fault.
Well, and all this blaming voters who didn't show
of
up
course.
or who voted for Jill Stein or whatever, you are supposed to convince these voters that you are worth voting for. That's on you, not on them.
Right.
One more point just in terms of the future, and I think this is very important, and it's one of the many reasons why having Bernie as president is so important. We need net neutrality. That is going to be used, it already is being used against us. I started off in 2016 when we were doing live streams, we were getting millions of views right away with a bunch of surrogates from Bernie land. We're not getting that now. I started at TYT and the algorithms at the Young Turks, I worked at the Young Turks, the algorithms worked differently then, and then suddenly our views were dropping 75%. And we as individuals were flexible. We can shift with that and change the titles and do all the things that Krystal was giving me advice on backstage. But at the end of the day, that I think is the weapon that they're going to use to control us, but they're going to use the excuse of the far right.
Yeah. Well, that's already happening. I mean, just really quickly, to tie back to what Katie was saying about the Bernie bro narrative. I mean, that's part of the weaponization of the Bernie bro narrative, too, is the one place where they can't control y'all is on Twitter and on social media and alternative media platforms. So they want to try to silence you there, too, by saying, like, your memes are unacceptable and whatever. I mean, that's the other part of it. They're so thin-skinned, right? They think they should be able to put out their wrong opinions, wrong offensive opinions in the world and not get any blowback. And the fact that you dare challenge them is like beyond the pale.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the violence that they look at. That's what they described as violence, mean tweets.
Yeah.
Meanwhile,
Right.
And there were two, not to harp on 2016, I'm basically just saying this to discredit these people. That's why I keep talking about it, because exposing their hypocrisy is a gateway, a gateway argument, I think, for some people. Then you realize how bad their ideas are. But there were two physical attacks during the primaries committed around the primaries over Sanders, Clinton. Nomiki was present at one of them. There were two physical attacks committed by men against women, and they were both committed by Clinton men against Sanders women. One was Wendell Pierce, the actor from The Wire, that did get some coverage. Hillary Clinton was never asked to condemn it, to disavow her followers and the violence that they engaged in. He was charged with battery because he attacked a woman who was a Sanders supporter. The other incident got no coverage whatsoever, and this was at a Democratic state meeting?
The State Democratic Committee meeting where we chose who was going to be the chair of the New York delegation, and they silenced our votes, and a couple of us went to the front, and there was a woman next to me who was live streaming, Mumita Ahmed, who was hit by a man with a cane and who told her to sit down, and then she challenged him, and then he hit her again.
So you see that you hear him doing this. He hits her with his hand and with his cane. She's a young woman of color, and he's an older, no disrespect. Well, don't say now they're going to feel bad. He happened to die after this, but he still hit her. It's okay. We're not speaking ill of the dead. We're speaking truth of the dead. So yeah, he was a donor, and he hit her. I mean, can you imagine the outrage if this had been the other way around? A young woman of color hit by an older, then living, straight white dude, and no one says anything. And of course, this is the other big point is that, I mean, no one here is saying that representation isn't important at all.
No.
We're saying that ignoring policy and ignoring the way policies impact these very marginalized groups and pretending that that one person, the identity of one person is more important than the identity of countless people who are much less powerful than this one person. The problem is that calculation and framing identity politics as one powerful person's political assent or dissent versus how it affects the people who really don't have power the most. Yeah.
Right.
I think that this is all extremely true and important, and this to me is one half of the strategy, which is that we have to be able to dispel the misinformation. We have to hold people accountable and hold people's feet to the fire. We have to be, like you said before, brave enough to not worry about the sort of waves of cancellation that are coming our way if we say this is obviously, transparently bullshit. And I think we've gotten a lot better at that, actually, as a movement. But that's only one half of the strategy. We also need, in order to build an offensive strategy, this is a defensive strategy, absolutely necessary. In order to build an offensive strategy, we need to build a new sense of political identity. So we need people to feel not that they are just angry because other people are doing things and they don't like what other people are doing. They need to feel that they themselves are a part of a movement that is attempting to do something discrete, right? And they need to be able to articulate what that is. So this is the value of democratic socialism, and it's why Bernie Sanders has continually self-identified as a democratic socialist throughout decades when it was completely toxic to do so, is because he knows that we need to rebuild into our side a sense of a positive political identity that we all share, and that has shared principles and a shared short-term agenda and a shared long-term agenda, because that's what's going to keep us going through all of the ugly battles where we're playing defense, even as we get better and better at playing defense, right?
And don't underestimate how much anti-war, sorry, just last thing. Don't underestimate, I didn't mean to cut into your very well-deserved applause, but I'm sorry, that seemed obnoxious. I just want to say, because I know we're going to get silenced soon. Don't underestimate how much anti-war voices are marginalized, even by progressive media, even places we used to count on. Because, and I'm going to say this, and I don't care, some people are going to cancel me. If you look at what happened with Syria, no one's covering the whistleblower, the fact that I thought we cared about this stuff. I thought we cared when there were not WMDs and there was war because of that. And no one's talking about the whistleblower at the office, OPCW, and how maybe there wasn't chemical. The gray zone. Okay, the gray zone is, yes. Check out the gray zone. Media. But that there wasn't that. Mattis himself said there was not evidence of this. And even saying this now, I'm afraid people are going to be like, oh, you sound like a conspiracy theorist. But I don't care, and no one should care, because this is something no one talks about and everyone kind of wants to. So talk about it. Talk about it. Yes. Okay. That's it. Sorry.
We should start.
Okay, awesome. So in the spirit of collective ownership, we're going to move to the Q&A section.
Oh.
If people want to come up with questions, we have 2 microphones right there. Line up, and let's get some audience questions in. We have time for 2 questions.
2 questions. Boy, make them good.
How much do we have to respond? Should we keep it brief?
Yeah. How much for each person? Cut us off.
You should cut us off. No, we want to hear these guys speak too.
Exactly.
We'll play it by ear.
I'll talk fast. So I'm in the Graduate School of Education. I work with students right now in Boston in high school. And I find a lot of the stresses of teaching history, that's what I teach, is providing narratives that are good for the students, whether they're centered or communicating both sides. I was wondering if you guys can maybe talk a little bit to what our obligations are to our students today, especially in light of the current, crises that we're facing.
Howard Zinn.
Excuse me?
That's right.
Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn, the historian,
I don't actually know. I don't understand what the strictures that are probably placed on you in an institutional context are. I can say this, though, that we need to be doing popular political education and it may need to be supplemental to the institutional education because it may be more possible to do it in a sort of alternative setting. But to whatever extent you can, exactly Howard Zinn, tell a different story, a different narrative about how the sort of society that we live in came about and came to be so unequal, right? That's obviously necessary. I think I would think it incumbent upon a teacher to at least push, a teacher of history, to at least push the limits, right? And then, of course, we in Jacobin are known for having obscure articles about the history of the Finnish Civil War, and we will continue to do this.
Make
we are not going to stop, no matter how bored you are. We are not going to stop doing this.
I've learned a lot from Katie. Katie has taught me so much about communism that.
I am a red diaper baby.
No, and I say this because of the moment that we're in McCarthyism. And of course, we learned about McCarthyism. But this generation, I think, for this moment, understanding where we were just so recently, and also teaching them how to question. This isn't educational, but question everything. Right. Be the one person at the table, even if you agree with everybody, that dissents. Read the gray zone, just because you need to understand whether you agree or not.
Yeah. Oral history also.
If we have to listen to the right wing on MSNBC, I want to listen to the communists.
Right over here.
There's a lot of cynicism these days, a lot of talk about what we don't have, a lot of dystopian literature and end times talk. So I kind of want to hear from you on a more positive note, each of you. What is your dream for the future? Like, what do you see in your utopian, sci-fi, Star Trekian dreams? What stands out?
Wow, that's a big one. I mean, I guess it's fairly simple. I don't think it's that crazy to think that we could have basic dignity for every human. I mean, that's, a good life with meaning, community. It's maybe not a wild dream, but, a livable planet with clean air and clean water, dignity and meaning in our lives, family and community around us, where we see every human being as a human being, where workers in their workplaces are treated like human beings, where they are able to benefit from the fruits of their labor. It sounds radical, but I think it's fairly simple and fairly basic in what all human beings should be entitled to, especially in a wealthy country such as ours. There's just absolutely no excuse for it. I mean, poverty is ultimately a tool of social control. That's right. Because if people are desperate, you can make them work for $7.25. You can skimp on their wages. You can keep them down. You can keep them so tired that they can't participate politically. So it's a choice. That's a choice that we've made in this country to have the poverty that we have, and we could make a different choice.
A cornerstone of my vision for the future is the idea of democracy at work. We always talk about democracy in the political sphere, and of course we have not achieved a perfect democracy in the political sphere. One of the reasons why we haven't is precisely because we don't have democracy at work. So what I mean by that, and I'm going to recite something that probably a lot of you know, but I'm going to do it anyway in case some of you don't, is that capitalism describes an economic structure where the vast majority of people have to work for a wage to purchase the basic necessities of life. They work for a boss for that wage. The boss gives them the lowest possible wage that they can possibly get away with based on the degree of class struggle and the laws, which are, of course, a result of class struggle. And they appropriate the rest of the value of that labor as profit and keep it for themselves. And that's why they're so rich. And that's also why a lot of working people are so poor. So when we talk about democracy at work, we're talking about eliminating that relationship. We're talking about a more cooperative structure in the economy where we don't have tyrannical fiefdoms in the area of production. And I do think that will have a salutary effect for democracy in the political sphere as well. So that's the basic set of principles that I start from when I'm getting utopian.
Question. Communist space travel.
Shout out to Michael Brooks, sorry.
I mean, I think I can only think of one word, and it is democracy. Everybody else has said it's been poetry, but democracy is what I seek. It's how I describe democratic socialism in its purest state. It's what inspires me about this movement, and hopefully we'll see people as humans, every single person equally as a human and not as some sort of financial asset.
Mm-hmm. I was just thinking of notes, and there's like a common thread here because with the question about history, and I used to teach history, but there is something really important about oral history and history from below, and I think everyone actually should have their students read oral history, but also do it as homework. It's really great. And that's kind of the equivalent of a movement, though, right? It's not telling the story. It's not the powerful people. It's the anonymous people. It's people whose stories haven't been told. And I think that, for me, I guess there's two things happening at the same time, right? You have Sanders as a person, and as he's always like, the idea, he puts R's at the end of words where they don't have it, and then takes them off where they do. And I come from a long line of people who do that, so I love it. But, he's like, it's not like people these ideas are like, from people living like in the mountains in the avant-garde or whatever. These are like popular ideas. So that is very exciting, and it's a great combination of how you have like individuals making these ideas intelligible, but also you have huge mass movements behind them. And that combination is really exciting, and that I guess is the utopia, the first step for the utopia that I see. And it's not utopian. That's what's so great about it.
Yeah.
It's not utopian. It's very possible.
So I think ending on a question about utopia, the future, and the steps we should make is an apropos way to end the panel. Panelists, thank you so much for your input.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Oh, also Meagan
I have an
has an announcement.
I appreciate that you're all rising. I'm so sorry, this is awkward timing. But, okay. Who here wants Bernie Sanders to be the next president of the United States? There is going to be a canvas hosted by Harvard for Bernie. Tomorrow morning, I would like to see all of you there. I'm going to be there. I will give a speech there. I will canvas with you. And I don't know the time or place because it hasn't been determined yet because this was a last-minute idea. But that's one of the beautiful things about this movement is that it's a distributed organizing model and people just get so pumped that they just canvas spontaneously. So I would love to see you all tomorrow morning at a Harvard for Bernie canvas. And you can find information about that when it has been decided on the Harvard for Bernie Twitter page. Thank you very much.